So, what are the results of this court case, Citizens United? There are several trends that have happened over the past 5 years. We've seen and into. So, what are the results of Citizens United? So, we've seen several trends since the Citizens United decision. First, we've seen the rise of dark money, weakening of contribution limits, trampling of shareholder and employee rights, and then the rise of PACs, hybrid PACs, super PACs, and super duper PACs. First, Citizens United freed outside groups to raise and spend as much as they wanted towards the election of a candidate who they thought was favorable to their interests. It particularly gave the 1% a bigger voice. So they give the example in 2010, $2 billion was spent on the election. 60% of it came from 200 people. By 2014, we're down to 100 people, giving 70% of the funds that went to super PACs. Two names are mentioned: Sheldon Adelson, who is a Republican, conservative, and Tom Steyer, who's a Democrat and liberal. So I looked up for 2016, and we can see that the amount given to the super PACs has risen by 3%. Interesting, you can go to this website and you can look at who the donors are. We can see that Steyer and Adelson are number one and number two. So Steyer gave $89 million to liberals, while Adelson gave almost $78 million to conservatives. And so if we scroll down the page a few ways, one of the names on here is the DeVos family. Now, I'm assuming that the DeVos family, here we go, number 55, is Richard and Helen DeVos. They gave almost $3 million to conservatives. And let's keep scrolling down the list and see if we find the other DeVos. There's Richard and Betsy DeVos, who gave almost $2 million to conservatives. So when you think about it, that there's only 100 people that really are the ones influencing the political process, what does that mean about the rest of us and our ability to ultimately vote in who we want, but also our ability to come to the table with the people's issues rather than just the few? Dark money is money that comes from unknown donors. And because Citizens United opened it up to both foreign and domestic, we don't know what countries it's coming from or who is giving it. And the loopholes that have been put in place and shoddy rules that the Federal Elections Commission has, Congress has failed to really pass any legislation. And so now we see more and more money coming from sources that no one knows where they're coming from. Think about just recently when you see elections and you'll see a negative ad, but no one knows who is putting out the negative ad. That money is usually coming from dark money. Citizens United also weakened the amounts that people could contribute to a particular candidate, which ultimately allowed not only the PACs, the super PACs, and then dark organizations to work together for a candidate. It also created what are called buddy PACs, which they use and run former staff and consultants to raise money. Then they have what are called shadow parties or organizations that filled the same role. In other words, it has fueled more legislative attempts to roll back the amount that people can give and has created a bunch more ways that they can give. An interesting thing from the article that you read talks about these corporations are giving money for political reasons, and the shareholders don't have any say in how they're spending this money. So it ultimately is not in the shareholders' interest because they don't get their views or interests spoken, and they don't even have input into the political decisions. Um, First of all, most people that are shareholders have no idea where the money is going. On the flip side, it also affects employees, whether corporations or unions have asserted the right to coerce employees to participate in a particular advocacy of a candidate. So it was interesting during some past political events that certain corporations basically were forcing their workers to either vote a certain way or to participate in political rallies. The example given is Murray Energy, that really wanted to support Mitt Romney. And from the rally that they were forced to go to, then they used their images to make a political ad. Um, Sometimes there's political advertises in people's paychecks, and then sadly some corporations threatened their workers if they didn't vote a certain way that they would lay them off or move the company to out of the country. Two examples were Westgate Resorts and then Harrah's Casinos. And you have to wonder, and I did not look this up, does Adelson own those or have stock in those? So, what's a political action committee? These are committees organized around the purpose of raising and spending money to elect or defeat candidates. And so they have to be registered, and they have to provide a treasury name and provide any connected organizations. Usually, these PACs represent business, labor, or specific ideological interests. And there's supposed to be a limit on how much that they can give per individual to a political committee. But as you see, we have been eroding how much those limits are. And ultimately, it created a new, what is called a super PAC, that really is kind of different than the political action committees. It doesn't have to make a contribution to the candidates or the parties. And so it has these independent expenditures with no monetary limits. So, and this is where we really see the difference. These super PACs use the money for TV advertisements or manipulating social media, mailings. They might be doing those robocalls that just drive everybody nuts. And they are supposed to show who their donors are, but a lot of times that is lost in the dark money. Usually, the dark money is connected with these super PACs, or they even have dark money organizations. These are politically active nonprofits, and they aren't required to publicly disclose their donors. It's referred to as outside spending. So here's a case that's showing that we keep expanding the ability to basically influence the political system. So Kerry versus the FEC, he had two separate accounts, one for the candidate and then one that was independent. And so they ultimately said that, again, under First Amendment rights, that if you restricted one per individual, it was really limiting their freedom of speech. And so thus what they did is they created hybrid PACs that can have two accounts, one for the political candidate and then one that's the independent expenditures, aka dark money. Here's an example of how things can be influenced by having so much money involved in the political process. So everybody has heard of the Affordable Care Act, which was really a health care reform. And it was supposed to expand access so that people that couldn't afford insurance would have less to pay, and so that they could. And so ultimately, we know it today as the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. I did put this note on. The only one that at this time that is guaranteed medical care is inmates. We have to provide them their constitutionally provided medical care. Okay, here's the example of lobbying in healthcare reform. So look how much money was spent to lobby and depending on what side you're lobbying, but $396 million was spent lobbying for the healthcare reform, 166 million in advertising, and then 38 million in campaign contributions. So lobbying for or against healthcare reform, they spent over $600 million. And the majority of the money came from insurance companies and the health industry corporations. So ultimately, the Affordable Care Act ended up being very watered down from its original. Instead of public government run program, it was pushed to private insurance companies. So why is lobbying such an important issue? Well, here's an idea. So politicians, when they get out of a job of being a politician, what do? Well, this is kind of interesting. Almost half of them go into a lobbying firm or become a lobbying client. Some go to other federal government agencies, and some go to private organizations. But the big problem is that a politician then becomes a lobbyist. Finally, this is the super PACs, or as I like to call them, super duper PACs, is the McCutcheon versus the FEC, which was 2014. And Sean McCutcheon challenged the limits on the amounts that people could give to federal candidates. And through a 5-4 vote, once again, the Supreme Court ruled that the aggregate limits violated First Amendment. And thus they struck down the total amount $1 donor can give to candidates. Now, this allows joint fundraising committees. In other words, what they do is they go to a super duper PAC and they write a single large check that goes to this umbrella group, and then they can split the money over several beneficiaries. So when we look at this, most people think that Citizens United was a terrible decision and should be overturned, or Congress should have passed an amendment on campaign reform to eliminate the effects of Citizens United. But it's hard to get Congress to do something that is a benefit to them, rather than doing what would be ethical and the right thing to do. Now, in some states, though, they have taken action and have tried to make some reforms to limit the amount that can be spent. So this article that you read was just looking at the 5 years. So that was 2010 to 2015. But we've gone through more election cycles where we've seen more and more money being used to basically influence the direction of the United States. And being influenced by those 100 people that represent the 1%, which really the biggest concern is this stripping away our democracy. Now watch the video on Pay to Play, which is talking about how to become a politician and the money that is involved. And then you'll look at a case where money influenced who got to vote.